Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV WORLD. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two very important stories. The first is with reference to Pakistan's economic situation and the IMF program, in which we have heard from the Finance Minister, Mifta Ismail, that the IMF program will be able to be revived soon and that Pakistan will be hearing good news regarding the IMF program very soon as well. In an interview, he also spoke about different measures that, of course, were under discussion with the IMF and whether or not the government is going to be taking any measures with regards to salaries, income tax, and then, of course, fuel prices as well. So we're going to be talking about all the different measures that Pakistan will be taking in and the kind of impact that the IMF program is going to have and how soon we're going to be able to hear about it. Also, with regards to that, we will be talking about the budget and if any measures with regards to the budget are going to be changed as part of discussion with the IMF, and what are we going to be looking at before the 1st of July. So that's going to be our first segment of the show today. In our second segment, we will be taking a look at the situation in India with regards to the spread of Hindutva ideology. We have, of course, seen many incidents in India where people have been discriminated against, especially the Muslim population and also other minorities. And we've seen that coming in from different parts of the society, including the political leaders as well. And we've also seen that coming in from the institution which is supposed to provide justice to the people. The courts within India have also repeatedly over time given verdicts that reek of Hindutva ideology. And just now as well, we know that another such incident, the decisions have come with regards to the bulldozing of Muslim buildings and establishments where there were people living who were Muslim occupants and were reportedly also part of the protests against the blasphemous statements made by the BJP political leaders earlier as well. The court, however, has given its verdict against the Muslim population. Something similar in the past as well with regards to mosques also being declared as not essential to Muslim worship, just as previously the hijab was also deemed as not essential to Islam. So we're going to be taking a look at how the courts within India themselves are propagating the Hindutva ideology and are not providing justice to the people, especially the Muslim population as well, and how in contrast Pakistani courts have done not the same and of course have protected their minorities and the Hindu and Sikh populations as well. So we're going to be taking a look at that and then also analyze how the courts need to act in different parts of the world. For this and more, I've been joined in the studio as always by Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment regarding the IMF and the economic situations within the country, we have with us online Mr. Syed Javed Hassan. He's the chairperson Economic Advisory Group, and we've also been joined by Dr. Waqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director, STPI. Thank you very much for joining us and being part of the debate. I'll start with you, Mr. Syed Javed. When we look at the current situation, of course, all eyes have been on the IMF program and the finance minister's statement with regards to its revival being heard soon is, of course, a welcome statement. But there are, of course, many areas that were under discussion and a lot of problematic areas as well with regards to the kind of measures that Pakistan was asked to take. How do you see the IMF program coming in, and what do you think the measures that the government needs to take with regards to the IMF program will be? Will it have any impact to the budget and other measures that have already been announced by the government?
Thank you very much for having me on. Yes, I think this is excellent news. I'm very glad to hear the finance minister saying that it'll be revived in the next couple of days. I would imagine there'll be some changes in the budget. We've already seen fuel prices being increased. There's also a likelihood that we might have the tariffs in terms of taxation being introduced. There's also a chance that we'll see some measures in terms of the PIT, that's the personal income tax. There might be some increments there. There may be some changes in the slabs. And I think also in terms of government salaries. So those are things which I would imagine will be taking place. There'll also be some adjustments in terms of the provincial surpluses. The government had promised about 800 billion in terms of provincial surplus. Given the budgets of the provinces, that didn't seem to come through. So I would imagine that there might be some MOU signed with the provinces to see that we can come close to it. What overall IMF is looking to do is to get about, I would imagine, about 0.5% primary fiscal surplus. And the numbers that had been presented so far we're not really meeting up to that requirement. So I think a lot of the adjustments in the budget will be taken to meet that primary fiscal uh, surplus target. So I sincerely hope that happens in the next couple of days because Pakistan is in a very precarious situation right now.
Absolutely. I'd also like to speak to Dr. Vakar and Adam in the discussion. Dr. Vakar, of course, that this is a welcome announcement with regards to the IMF program. But again, as we were discussing earlier, there are a lot of different measures still perhaps there that are required by the Pakistani government and its people with regards to fulfilling the demands of the IMF. And that, of course, is going to be quite problematic as well. And it's going to be a challenging time for Pakistan. How are we going to be able to navigate this balance moving forward? Dr. Vakar?
I think just to take a lead from what Javed Saab was saying, the government is losing a very important time here, and they already knew the expectations of the IMF, which had been communicated to them right when they came to office. They knew this all along while the budget was being prepared. The parameters were known to them. Still, however, we ended up presenting a budget on certain assumptions which were not in line with the ongoing discussions with the IMF. And I believe that this mistake is really now sort of putting other macroeconomic fundamentals in jeopardy. And you've seen the pressure on the rupee. The market sentiments are not looking good. And of course, while Finance Minister has been saying that the staff level agreement with the fund is around the corner, it of course hasn't happened yet. And every 1 rupee that we shed against the dollar, there's an increase of somewhere around 100 billion rupees in our debt levels. So
Right.
this is the gravity of the.
Dr. Vakar, this is a very pertinent point. Let me ask you about the foreign reserves at this moment. We are told that we have got somewhere around $7 billion, and that is not enough to cover more than our imports worth 1.5 months. Do you think that if IMF resumption takes place, although we haven't seen that letter that was needed to further proceed for any kind of agreement, but even if that letter is generated, do you think that IMF's resumption will help us stabilize our foreign currency reserves?
That's a very important question, Farrukh. And yes, I think the news coming out of the Finance Ministry is informing that the letter of assessment from the IMF would actually unlock funding from 3 or 4 sources. Firstly, of course, the Saudis are standing by with a promise of $3 billion, which includes the deferred oil facility. There's a rollover of $2.5 billion expected from China. But then you also have the 2 multilateral institutions, including the ADB and World Bank, who have projected next year's pipeline funding or pipeline loans to the tune of $9 billion each. So they are all waiting for this IMF comfort letter to come out so that all this foreign funding could be unlocked.
So, Javed Saab, if we look at the current scenario, of course, if we talk about the last week, right at the end of the last week, what we saw that Pakistan, was in grey list before in FATF, and of course, talking about FATF, when a country is in the grey list, that is not good for the economy, and it is considered as a very bad factor of the economy. Now, once we are going to get out of FATF, don't you think that it is a very good indicator that Pakistan's economy will move on, and it will normalize in coming future? And while talking to IMF, government should talk about that as well. And if we talk about the our friends in the Western world, including America, of course, they are very influential when it comes to IMF. Talking to IMF, should it be considered that government should seek help from the Western countries as well?
Let's look at FATF. I think that's very positive news. There's an on-site visit that's required before we actually come out and get onto the white list. but let's assume the best and that will happen. Having said that, let's really separate FATF from IMF. I think the two are separate, but while it is very positive, I don't think coming out of the grey list in FATF has an implication for IMF. Uh, it's good for funds flow, it's good for our transactions, it's very good news that we are going to be out of the grey list, but let's not confuse it with IMF. Having said with IMF, I think it's very important that we separate this notion that we have in Pakistan that you have Western countries or certain countries that will influence the process and will make IMF give us funds because they feel like. There's a process, and it's a rigorous process. There's a mission that looks at the underlying fundamentals, the fiscal requirements. Then it goes to the management within IMF. From the management, it goes to the board. So it's really quite a rigorous process, and I think we should take away this sort of. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, we have these conspiratorial ideas that somehow the other, if the arms are twisted of the IMF management, we will get money on easier terms. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think we
Right.
need what is necessary, and these things, by and large, we have to keep in mind, are good for us. They are good for our economy. If we
Right.
have fiscal
Absolutely.
discipline,
Javed Sahab, this is a great point. But let me go back to the optimism created by Miftah Ismail Saab's statement. While on one side we are seeing that we might be able to stabilize the economy and we might be able to move in the right direction, but inflation is going up and up. And there is real-time damage being done to the economy in that context, especially the working class, especially the poor. While the poor is taken care of through these, targeted subsidies and similar kind of interventions, we don't see anything similar happening to the working class. Do you think that in coming days, even if we manage to right the ship, this damage can be undone?
can I just say, I think IMF programs is very mindful of the effect it has on the most indigent parts of our society, and I think they make provisions for it, and I think there's a specific focus that the lowest 5-10% are their measures, poverty alleviation measures included in whatever IMF program they are, and then there's World Bank. Once the IMF program is revived, there'll be World Bank programs which will further help. Having said that, I would like to make a point that should we not become back in the EFF program, the prospect of default is so much worse for the poor people and generally for the middle classes in Pakistan than taking the hardships that might be necessary. So I think between two hard alternatives, the alternative of taking some hardship within IMF program is much better than actually
Right,
going through a process
and of
where
course,
we may actually
that is
default.
unfortunate that we're stuck between those choices. Dr. Vakar, when we look at the situation, of course, it's understandable that right now the IMF program is going to give us some hope. But at the end of the day, of course, there's a reason why we're in this situation, and perhaps that has existed for a long time, and nobody's really done much about that. And there needs to be a lot of work done on that side as well. And we have these knee-jerk reactions coming in, and this work on a shallower scale being done over the years, but no substantial fundamental work has been done. How much of that is going to be required for us to not be back in this situation again very soon?
The concern, Dr. Saab, is not that we are between two hard choices. The concern is we have been there forever.
Yeah.
I think this is a very fair point. And in every IMF program we have been, 22 programs, one of the longest relationships with IMF, we just end up stabilizing in the very, very short term and then pull out from the program, or at least don't follow it through with the next step, which is the structural reforms to our taxation side, energy side, state-owned enterprises, and several other areas which are leading to economic hemorrhage. Yes, it's a fair point. Now, will this program be any different? I think this is what the fund has done when it is trying to not only put in place a stabilization prescription, it is also tinkering with the laws at the federal level. You have seen strengthening of public finance management law so that no political government should practice fiscal imprudence in future. Now, that, of course, has to be practiced by the parliament. The parliamentarians have to hold them to that law which they have amended on the suggestion of the fund. Likewise, in case of State Banks Autonomy Act, IMF is also asking to stop intervention in OGRA and NEPRA after amending their laws, of course. So I think the structural reform has been very hard to follow through. And unless we do that, our house won't be in order for the medium to longer term sustained economic growth.
Right. Dr. Saab, but regarding structural reforms, one question that really bothers me, I mean, while we systematically removed the subsidies from petroleum products and from the power sector as well, we have seen that India has actually doubled the amount. It keeps on increasing that. Why is it that impulsively, by default, we go towards these prices rather than focusing on these white elephants called SOEs that are just gobbling up resources, particularly, I mean, PIA. Before our eyes, they can't even go to many countries at this moment. And why is it that we keep on actually propping them up while actually punishing the common man on the street?
Exactly. And Dr. Waqar, if we look at, of course, the inflation, all of these subsidized and subsidies, if they get removed, the inflation would go high. Don't you think that it would have a very bad impact on the economy itself, because the business would go slow?
Yes. So I think both very important points on the subsidies, and the fact that India is able to sustain them and we are not. I think the question goes back to how well a country can target the beneficiary population. Currently, apart from the Ehsaas or Benazir income support program, no other subsidy mechanism has a optimal targeting mechanism. So a rich person is also getting the subsidy which a poor person should ideally get, or the lifeline customers of electricity and gas should get. So that's one. And India has been better at it. They have been better at mining the data which helps them to target subsidies in energy sector, oil, gas, power, and also in the commodities part, like wheat, sugar, etc. You have to have a mechanism. That has been slow to come by. Only now we are hearing that Ministry of Food Security has put up a food security dashboard which would allow them to match demand and supply data. The other point around the SOE reform is also important, and this is where I think the lawmakers and the judiciary need to help. So I do recall, without naming anyone, a former finance minister standing in front of the parliament and saying that any state-owned enterprise, and Farrukh Saab named PIA for that matter, any state-owned enterprise that I name for privatization, it suddenly becomes a strategic asset, and people go in the court. So this is where I think it's not about charter of economy. It's about institutions like parliament and judiciary being on the same page that we have to do something. There's a decent SOE triage plan which the Ministry of Finance has committed to, but they'll need the cooperation from the courts.
Absolutely. Mr. Saeed Javed, whenever we talk about the kind of structural change and reforms that we need, of course, that involves, as Dr. Waqar was saying, a lot of different institutions, consensus, political stability, perhaps leaders or political parties who are willing and able to make the effort that is required for these economic changes and other measures needed for Pakistan to grow. But all of this, of course, assumes that we can actually achieve all of this very soon and that there is work done in that regard. But again, we have had decades in the past where this hasn't been done, and we have suffered immensely due to that. Is there something perhaps in our immediate or urgent capacity that we can do despite not having this sort of consensus or not having the kind of structural framework that we require for long-term change? Can we perhaps force our way into this?
May I say something? I think there's a lot of talk about charter of economy. What would be really nice would be a charter of common sense. We can't really have the kind of subsidies that the country has tried to do. Just the subsidies that we had on petroleum products was about 140 billion a month. Now, if you imagine that over a whole year, that's more than the entire defense budget. The reality is India has oil prices or fuel prices which are significantly higher than Pakistan, despite their buying cheaper from Russia. So I think one of the things what channels like yours and media people and economic journalists should do is actually bring to home the reality of what economics means. And once we start understanding that there are no free lunches or there are no easy options, then I think the decisions will become so much easier for all parties. There is an expectation built amongst our public that there's free money to go around. And this free money is not coming from Pakistan's own resources, but coming from borrowed resources. I think it's time we come to grips with reality that we have to do some hard things. And I
Right.
think, unfortunately, some of this is being borne by some of the poorest sections that we should try and avoid doing by
Right.
providing as much
And
as
Javed
Dr.
Sahab, I have a bone to pick with you as well, if you allow me.
Please do.
Whenever I ask a question about middle class under distress, we end up talking about the very poor of the poor in the country. I understand that there can be some targeted intervention for them. But when you talk about the backbone of the economy, the working class, the middle class, hardly anybody has any solution for their distress, right? I understand that these subsidies should not be, infinite or forever. But at this moment, when you quickly actually remove them, and this is not my policy, this was policy of the previous governments, they actually continue this, and once it is removed, everything goes up. It becomes very expensive. While we are sitting in Islamabad and the government of Pakistan and the people of Pakistan are subsidizing Pakistan railways. Islamabad doesn't have railway. Many parts of the country are never touched by a railway. Similarly, PIA, so many others, Pakistan steel mills. Why is it that the taxpayer is paying for those bodies at this moment while they could have been, those resources have gone into providing them some relief?
Sir, I could not agree with you more. I think it's about time we look at the SOEs. They cost us anything between 300 to 400 billion in terms of subsidy. We read their annual losses that we have to fill. It's really the common taxpayer like you and myself that has to fund that kind of losses. Really, it's time that we look at them, privatize them, sell them, even if necessary, in some cases, sell them for 1 rupee. And probably many of these companies, as we found in the banks, become much more profitable and efficient when they're in the private sector. So I could not agree with you more. The other thing about the middle classes, you're absolutely right. They tend to be hit the hardest because there's not much concern in terms of providing them subsidies or targeted subsidies. There, I think what is required is a really look at our tax structure. A lot of this tax structure, a large part of our populace is not included in taxation. And some of these are quite rich people. I think if we had our tax to GDP ratio is only about 9 to 10%. In many places comparable, it's about 20%. If we had even if 15%, there'd be much more ability to actually provide some kind of facilities, if not subsidy facilities in terms of schooling, in terms of health for our middle classes. So we really need
Right.
to think about these things very carefully. We don't have the solution immediately, but there are solutions, but it requires a greater degree of equity in terms of taxation.
Right, absolutely.
Dr. Waqar, if we obviously look at the government has been talking about it, and today obviously Miftah Ismail, he highlighted it that he will be putting more taxes on the rich people, the rich class of the country. Do you think that we have seen in the past as well that if there are extraordinary taxes or unproportionate taxes on the top class or the richest class of Pakistan, they one by one start leaving the country? Would it have a bad impact on the economy as well?
Right, and Dr. Waqar, we're almost out of time, so I'll add my question as well. When we look at the situation that is going on right now, we have heard, perhaps all of my life, I've heard that Pakistan is going through a sensitive turn, and this has been something that we've been hearing for a while, and it seems that now that is actually essentially true, and it is quite a difficult time for the country. And I understand that the IMF program may be one small hope that we can look forward to, but in a sense, if we actually can get out of this moment of hardship, how soon would it be? How soon can we really say that Pakistan is in relief now?
Yes, thank you both. Very important questions. I think on the first one, yes, optimal taxation is something that we need. We don't want to overtax or add the burden to existing taxpayers, I believe the room is there. I'm one of those who believe that the taxation the revenue target kept by SBR in this year's budget should be ambitious. I think they have already reached the 6 trillion mark. They could have gone beyond having a target which is more than 7 trillion for next year. But anyways, they have a tax gap of somewhere around 2.5 trillion which they can tap into. This includes evasion, avoidance, or untapped sectors which they can go after. And this will really help not taxing the existing industry or the fixed income taxpayer group further. On your second question, which is that how soon we could come out, I think, yes, IMF could easily stabilize you for the next 2 to 3 quarters. But then, of course, there's a political transition which is expected in Pakistan, which IMF is mindful of. And I think this is where probably the handing over between the current government and the caretaker government, whenever it assumes the next year, will be a very delicate task, something that IMF will also be looking at.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Waqar and Mr. Saeed Javed Hassan, for being with us and talking to us at length regarding the IMF program and, of course, the economic situation that we're currently going through. We'll now move on to our second segment with reference to what is going on in India, and not just in terms of what the Muslim population and the minorities in India have to face, but of course the courts in India that have been giving verdicts in line with Hindutva ideologies and that are unjust in their essence. Of course, there's the issue of demolition of the Muslim occupants' building, and then of course there's such verdicts in the past where the essence of someone's faith is being questioned and challenged, such as a mosque not being declared as an essential part of worship for Muslims, hijab not being declared essential for Islam. And these are just the many ways in which we have seen that courts in India have continued to be dismissive of people's religion and their practices. And then, of course, we have seen that the only platform that exists to provide justice is also something which is marked by Hindutva ideology. And so, therefore, we don't see that sort of avenue that needs to exist for the Muslim population and the minorities in India. That, of course, should be. And Faisal, when we look at the situation, is of course very, very disappointing. The courts are there, of course, to provide justice for people to be able to go there and to plead their case. And yet we've seen that in instances in the past as well where Muslim population have gone up and talked about their due rights, it's not being given to them, and the verdicts that are given are of course in line with Hindutva ideology. It seems that the ways in which the Muslims and other minorities in India can actually go about having some sort of a normal life are being minimized by the day, and there is no real avenue left for them to explore.
Exactly, Sana. If we look at the Indian courts, either there are only two words I can use for them. Either they are accomplice to whatever is going on in India, or they are impotent. Whatever the decisions which are considered as sane decisions, they are not being implemented at all. We saw few days ago that court. Normally court takes days to decide about a case. We know that Mr. Javed's house, and of course his daughter is someone who's considered as a very young student voice. Of course she's a Muslim, and their house was bulldozed. As we know that in today's India, bulldozer is representing the authority over the minorities, and bulldozer is to me is being considered as the Chief Justice of India. Today's India is ruled by bulldozers, and that is what is going on. And if we talk about when Muslims protested against the decisions by the governments and against the government, then their houses were being demolished. But if we look at the protests which were conducted by youths of UP or Rajasthan or Gujarat or elsewhere, they've been told, okay, we're not demolishing your houses, but instead when we'll be, having a list of who's getting enrolled in the army, we will not be including your names. So this is what the kind of punishment they are going to give them.
Right.
So there are constant double standards which are representing today's India, and the world is watching India. And I
Right,
think
absolutely.
the tag India always enjoyed of being a secular nation shouldn't be there anymore.
All right. Let us also include in the discussion Dr. Jameel Ahmed Khan, who's a former ambassador. Thank you very much for being a part of the debate and joining us for this session. Of course, what is going on in India with regards to Muslims and the minorities in India is nothing new. We've known about it and talked about it for quite some time now. And we've also seen that the courts in the past have also given out verdicts which are, of course, not just and are in line with the kind of ideologies that has been put forward by the BJP regime as well. However, when we talk about the kind of verdicts that come out, is this something that we cannot question, perhaps on an international level, or perhaps in the way that when we look at a person's faith or a belief system, how is it that the court gets to decide what is essential to someone's belief or not?
Well, the courts could have any excuse to give this kind of a verdict because prima facie there is no rhyme and reason, and there is no international law which can allow any country or any, for that matter, judicial system which passes on this kind of a judgment and the verdict, where the fundamental human right, where the blatant violation of the law of the land, which is India, where the blatant violation of the international laws, not one, more than half a dozen laws, right? And I can quote those half a dozen laws which give protection to all such activities, are against all such activities, which the Supreme Court of India, the apex court of India, has today demonstrated. And my indication is the international laws are 1948, which is, of course, the Universal Declaration, Article 18, 1966, which is the Covenant of the Civil and Political Rights. Likewise, in the 81, Declaration of Elimination of Intolerance. And like in 1986, there was establishment of there was a report of the United Nations, and they had mentioned about right of freedom, religious freedom. And there were two more laws in it. I would not like to consume explaining those points. So talking about the Indian apex court, in recent past, there are more than about 10 such verdicts. If we connect the dots and if we try and interpret these verdicts, we would come out with one conclusion: one, that there are blatant violation of the local laws. And just to give you an example, that there were about more than 10 to 20 cases. People were convicted, the minorities, particularly Muslims, were convicted. Those who had done made derogatory remarks against the temples and against their goddies. Now, but not a single Hindu, or not a single, let's say, BJP member or RSS member was ever, because there are some, there are good Hindus also were ever convicted. So your question, fundamental question, can we question not only we, it could be entire international community. They can question by quoting them that law. The recent one was the United States report on the religious freedom, and even the statement of the Secretary of State Blinken on this count. So all these, but diplomacy is a multi-dimensional, multi-layered, and it can only be achieved with consistency and continuity. What we talk on these
and I understand your point, Dr. Jameel, I understand. But of course, this is India at the end of the day that we're talking about, who has taken major unilateral decisions in the past as well, despite there being the kind of paperwork and laws that exist, legal avenues, and then of course even moral obligations. But even then we've seen actions such as what happened in August 2019 being taken, and no consequence being there since then as well, when we're sitting in 2022. Farrukh, when we look at the situation, of course, there is a lot that we can say and condemn and point out that is incorrect, and how the courts should act or behave. But that's about it, because at the end of the day, when you have a court's verdict coming out within the country, how much of it can be challenged?
Right. Last time, Sana, when you were talking about India, one term or two terms actually continue to repeat themselves: unconstitutional, illegal, right? And I was wondering what legal, what constitutional, because usually when you talk about constitution only can act through institutions, right? And particularly their courts. But we have seen that since the BJP government came and Ranjan Gogoi was the CJI at that time, something very interesting happened. He actually tried to take notice of a few things. Then all of a sudden somebody came forward and accused him of sexual harassment. Then amazingly he appointed himself the supervisor on that case, and after that, that man actually gave up all agency. And after that, we have seen he has been rewarded as well. Similarly, NRC that took place in Assam was on the orders of the same Ranjan Gogoi. So at this moment, it seems that when you talk about India's judiciary, it has actually done this incredible damage to itself. While here and there are voices like the current Indian CJI, who is a conscientious man. But during the last time, when you actually particularly talked about 2019, Article 370, it was a test case for India's judiciary because it was an open and shut case.
Exactly.
The way they actually meddled with the interpretation of law itself and made light of it was obnoxious, right?
True.
This is one bad indicator that India's democratic institutions are failing. There's another that should worry you as well, and that is the recent elections in UP. We know that during the COVID time, there was incredible pain among the masses, especially the core voter of BJP, because of that oxygen shortage and because of COVID deaths, right? There were bodies that were just thrown into Ganga and that's it, right? But what is happening after that? Elections take place and BJP is returned. And that doesn't mean that there is not any economic distress, because right now this Agnipath violence that we have seen shows you that there is incredible pain and people have started protesting. So what does that mean? Gradually people are losing faith or use of these democratic institutions. That means in coming days you will see all arguments being settled through violence. And that is not a good news.
Absolutely not. Dr. Jameel, when we look at this situation, of course, it calls for a lot of urgent action. And when we were talking about 2019, I remember there was this clock that was put up in the federal capital marking the number of hours and days that have passed by. And we're sitting 3 years past that. And that's all that's happening. There hasn't really been much that has been done against the kind of actions that have been taken. And when we talk about what is going on while we sit and talk, of course, there are people who are suffering. There are people not just in occupied Kashmir, but also within India, both part of other minorities and the Muslim population as well. You earlier talked about consistent diplomacy and the different forms of diplomacy that can be taken. Can you perhaps elaborate on those? If there are certain avenues that you think are not being explored enough?
Let me explain that also, but my thoughts are triggered by hearing Farrukh Pitafi, and those are about 370. You know, that would give you a full idea about the apex court of India. Now, Article 370, once it was challenged. Now, first of all, it had the protection of Constitution, and Constitution, once they amended that, or once they brought the bill, that bill could not have been brought at the first place, because unless it was approved by the Kashmir Assembly, it could not be. So Kashmir Constituent Assembly, And if since that was not existing at that time, there was a governor's rule. So they got the ordinance from the governor and presented. So ipso facto, that could not have been even maintained. What to talk of, its proceedings and then finally its verdict. And if any jurist of the world, if they examine that within their own parameter of law, it's now coming back to your point. Now, yes, it's not only one. As I said, there are different forms of diplomacy, and one is the legal diplomacy, which, because since it's a court verdict and the international forums, all multilateral forums, they respect the court verdict, unless it blatantly goes against certain international laws. In that case, there are certain framework they try and invoke that, and how it is done. First of all, one has to establish that it is a violation of their own constitution and of their own law, and the transparent and the trial had not taken place in the very light of what is happening in India. For example, I'll give you just about 4 or 5 examples of it. One is the one which we are discussing, the verdict yesterday of Supreme Court. Have you ever heard the Supreme Court gives a en bloc verdict that demolition, the government not stopping the government to do the demolition of the minorities the houses, the Muslim houses in particular,
Right.
and then in past even the mosques. Those 5,000 mosques which were constructed by the Muslim rulers in India, the apex court once had given a rule that the mosque is not the only place where the Muslims can pray, and words to that effect. Then the ban on wearing the hijab, which had triggered some kind of a retaliation by Muslim world, but then it calmed down. Even
Absolutely.
the
Yes, thank you very much, Dr.
Would you
Jamila. But
love,
unfortunately, we're
to
out of
add
time.
that,
Thank you very, very much for being a part of the debate and taking the time out. Faisal, you wanted 1 minute at the end of the show. You have it.
Yes, Sana, I wanted 1 minute, and it is the 20th of June 2022, and I'm saying it, and it will be proven obviously later on. Right now, I mean, last week we saw there was one of the incidents in which one of the gurdwaras in Kabul was obviously bombed, and ISIS Khorasan was considered behind it. There is a news I want to share that in recent days, the raw NDS nexus, which was in the hibernation, and that raw NDS nexus, it had its own sources, very wealthy sources within Afghanistan. They have been activated once again, and what they want to do is, one by one, all of the activities, the terrorist activities, they will ignite within Afghanistan, just to blame Pakistan, and India will keep on blaming, and Indian media will be blaming Pakistan in coming days that whatever is going on in Afghanistan, Pakistan is behind it.
Right.
This is just to affect the brotherhood which is existing between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
All right, and Faisal, as you know, Farrukh will never let you have the last word. He has asked for 15 seconds. You have it, Farrukh.
No, I actually wanted to compliment both of you for excellent points and excellent conduct of the program.
What nice usage of your time. Thank you very much, Farrukh and Faisal.
And it's a medallion for us.
As always, we'll see you all tomorrow.